Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Molnar, and I'm an industry and innovation writer for Education Week. I also write for the Marketplace K-12 blog, and this morning we'll be talking a little bit about procurement, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with from your districts, and about challenges. I'm sure many of you are also familiar with some challenges, but the kinds of challenges that our guest today has in mind are quite different. So with that, I'd like to introduce Stephen Hodas, the Executive Director of Innovative New York City Schools. Stephen has done a fascinating thing, I think, in New York City. He's only been there less than 2 years, if you can imagine that. And in that time, he was asked to start changing the way procurement happens. So would you please explain to us what a challenge is to you and how you did that?
Sure. When Michelle talks about challenges, we're talking in this case usually about software challenges, but they can be other sorts of process challenges as well. If you've heard of hackathons or crowdsourcing, the idea is you put a whole bunch of energized people together in a room and see what they come up with. You give them a broad problem definition that's not terribly well specified because you want to leave it to their imagination, their thoughts about what a solution might be, rather than the way government typically approaches these things, which is to heavily specify what the problem is, heavily specify what the solution is, and then you only get what you asked for, but you don't always know the best thing to ask for.
So please give us a few examples of how you brought this design thinking into schools from your experience as an entrepreneur to make changes that are happening now in the classroom.
So if you think about innovation, I think there was a sort of an innovation 1.0, which we're still in a lot of ways, where an innovation is a thing, right? It's an iPad, that's an innovation. So if I give it to you, then you're innovative. Or small schools, that's an innovation. So if you do that, then you're innovative. But that's not how entrepreneurs and innovators out in the world tend to think. Innovation's not a thing for them. It's a process, it's a verb, right? It's a way of thinking about problems and responding to them, trying things, discarding things that don't work, and amping up the things that do work. And so the idea behind these challenges is to bring that process inside, in a sense, so that you can try things that you might not have thought of very, very quickly with low stakes and see what's working. And if it is working, amplify those effects. And if it's not, throw it away because you're going to fail most of the time. I mean, innovation is more about failure than it is about success. And I think that's one of the most difficult things for districts and governments to understand because the stakes can be so high if you're perceived to fail. And that caution makes it hard to try new things, and then you're in this trap of doing the same thing that you always did.
So your first challenge was the GAP app challenge, which answered the need about, would you explain that, please?
Yeah, so we're funded from a federal Investing in Innovation grant, which we got a few years back before I joined. And the domain of that grant was middle school math, so that's sort of what we inherited, and that was fine. And again, typically, at least in New York, the way if you wanted to affect middle school math, what you would do is some people at the central district office would decide what the problem with math is, and then they'd issue this RFP. So we approached it really differently, and so we actually spent a month going out to our schools and talking to middle school math teachers and middle school math coaches and principals and kids to get a sense of what they thought the problem was. And what they told us pretty universally was that the problem was the gap in abilities that existed within a single classroom between the highest performing and the lowest performing kids, and that range made it hard for them to actually teach middle school math to anybody. Which is not something we ever would have come up with. If we were defining the problem, we'd say, oh, it was percentages, you know, it was ratios, if you could get kids to understand that, and we would have issued some kind of curriculum challenge or RFP. So we took that problem definition and we actually made a little 3-minute animated movie about it because we wanted to engage with people who weren't traditional curriculum developers. And we got some private money to raise for prizes, and Amazon Web Services donated a bunch of web service credits, and we put this challenge out to the international community of developers. And we were hoping for around 40 responses. We got almost 200 responses, which was a nice problem to have. And then following through on this idea that you want the users really closely involved, we had probably maybe 60 or so evaluators of these things. We had panels just of educators. We had panels who were looking at Common Core alignment. When we asked teachers to review these things, they only had one question to answer, and that was, would I use this in my classroom? Because if they said no, there was no point in doing any of the other evaluation. And those that made it through that filter, then we had user experience experts, we had venture capitalists looking at the viability of the organization, because we want to invest in people who are going to be around. It was much, much more successful in terms of participation and new ideas than we would have had it been a conventional RFP sort of process.
So you had the winners of the challenge, and what are they doing now, and how many of them were there?
So strictly speaking, there were two categories. There were for solutions that were primarily instructional and curricular, and then there was a whole other category for things that were about student and family engagement, administration, data visualization, all the kind of non-curricular things that actually determine in large part whether kids actually learn. So there was a first prize winner and a second prize winner in each of those categories. They got some money, not a lot, and then 5 honorable mentions. But we put in this sort of extra incentive for the developers to participate, which was that anyone who entered, was, whether they actually won or not, was eligible to be chosen by our schools to bring their software into that school, and working with the teachers and the administrators over the course of the school year in the school as a collaborative team to refine and iterate that product so that it more closely fit the needs of a real urban classroom. Because one of our principles is that we want to make our vendor partners better at what they do. We want to make them smarter and more familiar with what our challenges are so that we can get better stuff from them. And especially with the smaller, newer companies that I mostly work with, a lot of them have never spent time in our classrooms. They imagine problems that aren't really problems, or solutions that are really impractical, and that's a waste for them and it's a waste for us.
So if they say if it works in New York, it can work anywhere, can this work anywhere? What advice would you have for people in other districts to try this type of approach?
I mean, I think we're talking about software, but it's not software specific. This is really, it's a toolkit or a lens for thinking differently about how you define your problems, where you go to look for solutions, how you evaluate those solutions, and how you refine and iterate the implementations of them. And so we apply that to a whole range of things that have nothing to do with software at all. And I think very much it can happen anywhere. And I think it starts with, like everything else, it starts with leadership, to create a climate where people are celebrated as much for the things that fail as they are for the things that succeed. Because until you get to that point, your hips are not going to be loose enough to move like that. And that's a cultural thing, and it really needs to sort of start at the top, I think.
How does innovation differ in the classroom, at the school level, and at the district level, and how is it the same?
That's a great question. I mean, I think good teachers are profoundly innovative, and the things that I'm talking about trying new things and evaluating whether they work and iterating that, they're doing that all the time. That's what makes them good teachers, even if they don't have a formal framework for it. And one of the things that we found in New York, which is funny because our principals have a tremendous amount of autonomy over their budget and their staffing and what goes on in their schools, and we have 1,800 schools. And yet, despite that autonomy, a lot of the freedoms that people have in the classroom are limited by the way the district goes about procuring or defining tools and solutions. And so a lot of times we in the central office are the limiting factor. We should be a supporting factor, but a lot of times we're the limiting factor, even in the case where principals nominally have a lot of autonomy. If there's a particular tool or program that they want to use, our procurement practices can make it really, really hard for them to get hold of that and use it in a timely manner. And we, again, as a large district, very much have a compliance mentality about a lot of things. A lot of these, what I refer to as sort of the district operating system, procurement, contracting, IT, the things that make the district run, limit what can happen in the classrooms a lot of times. And there's a culture, again, in government in general, that those functions don't necessarily see themselves as part of a learning solution or as part of the accountability chain. And yet somebody who's making a decision says to a principal or a teacher, no, you can't use that, or I'm not going to make it possible for you to acquire that during the school year in time for it to make a difference, that actually has a huge impact on the outcomes for those kids. And so again, it's partly a cultural thing about having everybody at the district, no matter what their function, thinking of themselves as solving problems for the people who are doing the work in the schools, because I mean that's It's the only reason we have jobs, is to solve those problems.
Right. And tell me a couple problems that you're now working on, new ones.
Let's see, we did a really interesting thing. We have high school choice in New York, 700 programs for 8th graders to choose from, but we didn't have any tools for them to use, not even the most basic ones. We published this directory about this thick, and we'd have these high school fairs, which are pretty grim. So we invited, in a different process, a small number of people to come in, and again, we interviewed our guidance counselors and our parents and our kids, and then we put those problems to a bunch of developers who are working on tools to help parents and kids and eventually guidance counselors choose the best high school program for them. Our former chancellor, we changed administrations in the new year. At the end of the prior year, our chancellor was very pleased with this format of doing things, and he actually issued what we call the Chancellor's Challenge, where he invited every division in the DOE to submit to us a problem or a process that they were stuck on, or just wanted to improve, or some crazy idea, and we got about a dozen or so really interesting applications that we're just beginning to work on now, and we'll be able to sort of talk about what comes out of that in a couple months. So lots of things. We're doing something now. Our new mayor has a strong initiative on family and community engagement, as well as mental health services in schools, so we'll be doing a citywide challenge, not just with the Department of Ed, but with other municipal agencies as well, and the idea is to bring lots of municipal data, make it available in ways that's easy for people to build against, and have all kinds of great solutions come out of that.
That's terrific. Please, thank you so much for your time. Please join me in thanking Stephen Hodas.
Thank you.
And now you'll hear about arts education from Carolee Adams and her guest.